As Andrea Mitchell's intern, I've had the privilege of working with her in preparing news stories covering everything from our nation's straggling public education system, the 2010 midterm elections, and WikiLeaks. Her role as NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent, as well as the political show host of Andrea Mitchell Reports, has given her veteran status when it comes to all things regarding media and the government. But it turns out she also knows a thing or two about culture. I sat down with her to talk about her role as a cultural broker. We then talked about the state of journalism and new media. As one of the Board of Trustees members on the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, I asked Andrea her thoughts on the importance of preserving culture.
I love the museums here. I think it's so important to raise money and preserve and protect the arts, the crafts, the folk art, the furniture, the other, the documents and the other wonderful artifacts. It's a way of educating ourselves constantly and reinventing ourselves about our own national history. And so, as a student of history, I want to do whatever I can to preserve that part of our culture and to disseminate it more broadly to students, to teachers.
Journalists who report stories on site often have unique perspectives on history. In her memoir, Talking Back, Andrea says, quote, "I realized anew that journalism was for me more than a business or a profession. It was a way of living, of experiencing the world even as I instantly distanced myself from it, in order to recreate what I'd witnessed for the public." She shares some more of her thoughts.
To see those locations and see it through the privileged access that we get as journalists. I mean, walking through the gates of the White House or the State Department or the Pentagon, going to Berlin with Ronald Reagan and hearing him say, tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, and seeing it really from the front row. So you experience history that way, but you have to communicate it to people through word pictures, through all of the tools that we have at our disposal when we create these little moments, these little movies that we put on the evening news and now post, whether it's on Twitter or on our webpage or wherever. But at the same time, there is a sort of a remove, because if you're covering something that is violent or controversial, the way I approach journalism, because I am rooted in traditional journalism, is to approach it as objectively, and that is a very subjective term, but as objectively as one can.
We talked about her role as a cultural broker when she goes and reports stories abroad.
One thing you have to realize is that you're always viewed as a representative of the United States, whether you are or not an official representative. You are an unofficial ambassador, so I think it's very important to be sensitive and respectful to other cultures. Unfortunately, often when I go places, it's because it's a conflict zone or because there's a crisis. And we get thrown into a situation where our interactions with people are generally under the worst of circumstances, whether it's a hurricane or an earthquake or disease or famine or war, going to Sudan and to Darfur and to Bosnia during the conflict there. And all of my trips to the Middle East are generally either because of conflict or because of unresolved conflicts, whether it's stalled diplomacy or actually war. And so it's just terribly important that we first of all go as best prepared as we can be intellectually and to know the roots of the problem, to really study, no matter how esoteric or obscure it may be, and how urgent the emergency. We have to prepare very quickly sometimes from our generalist background to be less superficial and more knowledgeable. So that's the first test. The other thing is to be really respectful of cultural issues, whether they are religious, ethnic, tribal, or otherwise. I mean, I'm very, even though not required to be, I'm always respectful of dress codes. And it isn't my culture, but I have to understand that is the way one deals with people. And sometimes it's for a matter of safety.
Good journalists recognize the importance of being culturally receptive, but that doesn't always mean other countries will share that line of thought. Andrea, however, remembers a moment when a country opened up.
There's hostility, certainly deep suspicion, resentment, which goes back generations. One of my most wonderful experiences was in 1996 going to Vietnam for the first time and before normalization, in advance of diplomatic relations being restored. And I went on my own with an NBC team and traveled all over the country and had wonderful experiences that I did not anticipate, because I thought that there would be resentments from the war years. And it was such a wonderful way of completing the circle, because as a student, as an undergraduate, I had been right in the middle of the Vietnam War controversies, and as a young reporter had to cover the fallout from that. And so then having, time forward dissolved from the 60s to the 90s and seeing this vibrant economy still under the yoke of a very totalitarian regime, and with a great deal of censorship and problems that we experienced with the foreign ministry at the time, but still the beginning of engagement, and the people were so eager to practice their English and ask me questions, and it was completely different from what I would have expected.